Right now, scattered across hidden Discord servers and deleted Reddit threads, groups of people are conducting a highly specific psychological experiment. They aren't trying to summon something that already exists. They are trying to create a consciousness from nothing, using only coordinated human attention. They call it the Skoll Experiment. There is no institutional oversight. There is no ethics board. The people involved aren't looking for community. They are using structured rituals and cognitive narrowing to force an anomaly into existence. It sits on the uncomfortable edge between psychology, internet folklore, and something that resists cleaner categorization. But the strangest part of this phenomenon isn't the methodology. It's the fact that, according to the psychological data and their own leaked session logs, it appears to be working. To understand exactly what these groups are building in the dark, we first have to look back at how a group of researchers in the 1970s proved just how terrifying collective imagination can be. In the mid-20th century, a group of researchers in Toronto conducted what later became a frequently cited episode in parapsychology literature. The Philip experiment was a deliberate attempt to generate a ghost through collective imagination. While the researchers framed their reports carefully, the participants described phenomena that exceeded what they had anticipated. Whether those reports reflected genuine perceptual experience or the mechanics of concentrated group expectation was never settled to anyone's satisfaction. The crucial takeaway isn't paranormal in nature. Rather, it's that a group of people, working together with a shared and deliberately fictional premise, began having experiences that defied the boundaries they had built for themselves. Decades later, that unresolved space found its way online. The internet became a hosting environment for a specific kind of psychological experiment, particularly in the years following the widespread adoption of Reddit, Discord, and image boards with strong subcultural identities. These experiments are conducted without credentials and without institutional oversight. They draw a participant base that brings both genuine curiosity and significant variance in what they are looking for. Tulpa communities were among the first online spaces to systematize the practice of deliberate thought-form creation. The concept itself predates the internet significantly. It has roots in Tibetan Buddhist practice, was reinterpreted by early 20th century Western occultists, and arrived in internet culture carrying both its original context and a large amount of retrofitting. The online Tulpa communities of the early 2010s eventually developed a practice stripped of most of its religious or metaphysical framing. It was recast instead in a vocabulary borrowed loosely from psychology and cognitive science. The Tulpa, as described in these communities, is a persistent mental construct, a presence developed through sustained and specific attention, capable of operating with a degree of autonomy from the host consciousness. Whether that framework is a coherent psychological description, a useful metaphor, or a category error remains an open question. However, the consistency of reported experiences across dedicated practitioners is well documented. People report distinct inner voices, distinct perspectives, the sensation of being observed or responded to from within their own cognition. The research literature on internally generated speech and subvocalization is relevant here, though the practitioners themselves tend to describe something that exceeds those frameworks in ways that are difficult to operationalize. The broader Skoll-adjacent experiments draw their core strength from this tradition's group dimension. A single individual cultivating a private thought form is already a rich phenomenon. Scaling that attempt to a collective group makes the dynamic considerably stranger. Groups of people share a detailed, emotionally consistent fictional entity over weeks or months, and collectively attend to it in structured sessions. When this happens, the psychological dynamics that emerge are well documented in adjacent fields. Research into shared mental models demonstrates that groups can develop synchronized representations that individual members begin to experience as semi-autonomous. This describes how distributed cognition functions under conditions of sustained coordinated attention, without requiring any metaphysical leaps. The problem, when applied to these online experiments, is that the conditions are deliberately designed to destabilize boundaries. The boundary between what participants understand to be internally generated and what they report experiencing as external or responsive. The groups are not simply building a shared story. They are training their attention toward a specific point and waiting for that point to respond. And then there are the reports. The reports are consistent enough across different communities and time periods to be interesting. The actual accounts are quieter and in some ways more disorienting. A sense of presence during sessions. Hypnagogic imagery consistent with the agreed description of the entity. Dreams that multiple participants independently report as featuring the same figure without prior communication. Objects noticed out of place in ways that participants attribute to the entity before catching themselves doing so. Typed responses during automated board-style exercises that feel as though they originated from outside their own volition. None of this, taken individually, strains normal psychological explanation. Expectation shapes perception. The hypnagogic state is particularly responsive to primed cognitive content. Shared narrative creates the conditions for shared interpretation of ambiguous events. The reporting bias in these communities runs heavily toward experiences that fit the narrative rather than those that don't. And the social dynamics of group experiments create powerful incentives for participants to report alignment rather than absence. The researchers at Princeton's PEAR lab spent decades examining whether human intention could produce statistically measurable effects on physical systems. Their findings were contested, their methodology criticized, and their conclusions never achieved scientific consensus. Ultimately, they produced a detailed picture of how seriously trained researchers can sustain experimental programs. Programs built around subtle effects that hover at the edge of what standard analysis can meaningfully distinguish from chance. The PEAR work is not directly connected to the online experiments under discussion, but the epistemological problem it represents is exactly the problem these communities live inside. How do you evaluate evidence that is structurally resistant to clean falsification? There is a further layer to this that the more analytically inclined participants have written about with some sophistication. It concerns what happens when a group experiment begins to succeed by its own internal standards. In the early stages of these projects, most participants maintain a relatively clear metacognitive awareness. They know the entity they are addressing was constructed by the group. The double consciousness, engaging sincerely while holding the knowledge of the frame, is described as deliberate, even necessary. The experiment requires genuine engagement to function. Passive or ironic participation produces nothing, so they engage. Yet, after weeks of sustained engagement, some participants report the metacognitive frame beginning to loosen, not collapse. Most do not describe a moment where they fully believed the entity was independently real. What they describe is something more incremental and more uncomfortable. A growing difficulty in locating the clear line between their intentional direction of attention and a felt sense of the entity's independent presence. The Ganzfeld studies were sensory deprivation experiments from the parapsychology literature. They explored whether information could pass between minds in the absence of normal sensory input. They are interesting in this context because they documented how quickly the perceptual system can begin producing structured content in low information environments. These experiments had their own significant methodological controversies, but the fundamental perceptual dynamic they identified is not controversial. Reduce incoming signal, and the brain begins generating its own. Online entity experiments are not conducted in sensory deprivation, but they often rely on deliberate attentional narrowing. Sessions are typically held late at night, in darkness or near darkness. sometimes with instructions to limit external stimuli before and during the exercise. The participants prime themselves for the perceptual dynamics that produce exactly the experiences they seek. Researchers studying online behavior have documented extensively how digital communities develop shared interpretive frameworks that come to function as perceptual filters. A subreddit or a Discord server oriented around a particular phenomenon begins to generate a kind of internal epistemology, a set of unstated agreements about what counts as evidence and what kinds of reports are credible. Within these frameworks, the absence of an experience often becomes evidence of insufficient engagement rather than evidence against the phenomenon. That is a closed epistemic loop, and it is one that these communities frequently demonstrate. The Skoll framing, whatever its origin, functions partly as a legitimizing label. When participants attach a named experiment to what they are doing, it activates a set of assumptions associated with experimental design. The name implies methodology. It implies reproducibility. The name changes what they are looking for, and what you are looking for has a remarkable influence on what you find. Some of the more careful participants in these communities are entirely aware of all of this. Some possess backgrounds in psychology or neuroscience and articulate the confirmation dynamics with precision. Yet, they continue to participate. Their position is fascinating. They acknowledge that psychological explanations account for the available evidence, but argue that this acknowledgement does not foreclose the possibility of something additional. The psychological mechanism might be real, and the anomaly might also be real, operating at a level the mechanism doesn't fully capture. This is not a logically incoherent position. It is, however, one that is structurally immune to disconfirmation in ways that should be noticed. Curiously, a consistent blind spot across these communities involves the aftermath, the formal dissolution of the group, the collective agreement to stop attending to the entity they built. Participants describe this phase in ways that are notably different in tone from their descriptions of the experiment itself. They describe difficulty disengaging, a persistence of the patterns they had cultivated, the sense of presence continuing past the formal endpoint of the experiment in ways that feel different, ways that feel less chosen, less structured. Several describe a period of deliberate cognitive counter-conditioning, actively attending to other things, filling the attentional space that the experiment had occupied, working to dissolve the associations they had spent weeks building. These are people trained by the internet to produce meaning collaboratively and to distribute narrative labor, to experience coherence as something constructed and held in common rather than found. Applying those skills to the deliberate creation of a shared psychological entity is not, when you examine it that way, particularly surprising. It is those skills doing what they do, pointed at a different kind of object. Consider how the format propagates. Someone encounters a post describing a previous experiment, reads the session logs, and notes the consistency of reported experiences. They begin to feel the pull of replication. It is produced under conditions that every skeptical epistemologist would flag immediately. The groups that form around these experiments are not, in the main, credulous. They debate methodology. They introduce controls. They argue about whether a reported experience should be filed as data or dismissed as noise. The seriousness with which they approach the exercise, in fact, may be part of what makes the exercise work, whatever work means here. Genuine engagement, sustained over time, by people who are genuinely uncertain, produces something different from what either a true believer or a deliberate skeptic would produce. It produces a middle space, and that middle space is, by design, uncomfortable to inhabit. It is in that discomfort that the most interesting accounts accumulate. There are threads that have been archived and then deleted. There are Discord servers that ran for months and then went quiet without explanation. their members dispersing back into other online spaces or simply going silent. The documentation of what occurred inside them exists in screenshots, in pastebin archives, and in cached forum posts that are sometimes retrievable and sometimes not. The accounts are not consistent in their conclusions. Some participants describe experiences they came away treating as meaningful in ways they do not try to specify precisely. Others describe the entire process as a sophisticated encounter with the limits of their own suggestibility. Some describe both simultaneously, without apparent contradiction. The name circulates. The format replicates. New groups form around the same loose structure, sometimes aware of previous iterations, sometimes arriving at identical configurations independently. The convergence on similar forms across separate groups is itself a data point, though what it is a data point about is not immediately obvious. Ultimately, something very specific is being attempted, something repeatable enough in its structure that it has accumulated a label, however unstable and contested that label is. Something producing consistent enough subjective reports that people keep undertaking it. Whether that question has an answer, and where that answer would come from, is not something these communities have been able to establish. The experiments continue in various forms, in various spaces, with various levels of rigor and self-awareness. The entity, whatever the entity is, persists in the attention given to it. When the attention stops, the presence fades. Yet the precise nature of that presence remains something no one has been able to describe in a way that satisfies everyone who is there. Ultimately, the Skoll experiment doesn't need to prove the supernatural to be unsettling. It simply proves how fragile our baseline reality becomes when subjected to coordinated focus. We have learned how to build ghosts out of pure attention. And the internet has made us very, very good at paying attention together.